I'm Bill Kelly. I run the blog JFK Counter-Coup. I'm an original founding member of CAPA and the Committee for an Open Archives. And what I'm going to do is give you a synopsis of the events that led up to where we are today with the JFK tapes. They're a work in progress, and we're not finished with it yet, but it's pretty fascinating information, and I'm really proud to present this. And I think there's a lot of new information coming out about it as we go along. I first got involved back in, I guess it was the early 80s. I went to Dallas and I met Wes Wise, the mayor, a former mayor of Dallas and a reporter at the time of the assassination. And he gave me a tour of Dallas and took me to the Tippit murder scene and told me about Tippit's best friend, Carl Mather, who was with Tippit the morning of the assassination. And after the assassination, he went to visit Tippit's widow. And later it was reported that a person resembling Lee Harvey Oswald was driving around Oak Cliff in Carl Mather's automobile, a Plymouth. And then Wise tells me that Carl Mather worked at Collins Radio. And that was the first I heard of Collins Radio. But then I got the volumes of the House Select Committee reports. And in that is George de Moornschildt's memoirs, I'm a Patsy. And in there he tells how he took Oswald to the home of Admiral Chester Bruton and tried to get him a job at Collins Radio, where Bruton was an executive. And then I read in the New York Times back issues of November 1st, 1963, a CIA raider ship was identified in the front page of the New York Times as being, the Rex was owned by Collins Radio. So all of a sudden, I'm developing a file on this company that I'd never heard of before. And so I wrote them a letter asking for, Collins had been purchased and merged with Rockwell International. So I wrote to Rockwell and I asked them for copies of their annual reports for 1962, 3, and 4. And when I received them, I was surprised to read they were proud of the fact that the Collins radios were used in the Air Force One, the Cabinet plane, and all the Strategic Air Command bombers. And their radio communications were coordinated out of a radio station, a relay station in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where Collins Radio headquarters was located. They had a building there they called the Fishbowl because it was a glass house. And that's where what they called the Liberty Station was. And the Liberty Station was the relay station for all the Air Force One, the Cabinet plane, and the SAC bombers. So I developed an interest in the company, and I obtained Collins' bio, and the company was founded by Arthur Collins, who in Cedar Rapids as a young man built his own radio receiver. And in the 30s, his radio was the only radio that could pick up the radio communications from Admiral Byrd, who was on his Arctic expeditions. So here's this young teenager in Cedar Rapids receiving these radio communications from Admiral Byrd in the Arctic and relaying the messages to the military in Washington. And he started a little company from his garage, and because of his relationship with the Navy, his company received a lot of military contracts during World War II. And then after the war, he became friends with General LeMay. And LeMay was a ham radio buff and had his own ham radio signals code, sign-off code, and him and Collins became good friends, and I'm sure LeMay helped arrange for Collins radios to be used by the Air Force One and the bombers fleet. So in reading the history of Collins, he talks about how the military decided at some point that they wanted to relocate their defense industries into the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and Collins opened up a factory in Richardson. Bell Helicopter relocated there, as did other General Dynamics. All of these companies all relocated to Dallas, Fort Worth at the same time for security reasons. And they discovered, according to Collins, that there was no graduate study program in that area that would develop the engineers they needed to build these companies. They had to recruit engineers from out of state. So they founded a graduate research center in Dallas, and Art Collins became the first director of this advanced research, graduate research study center. And in 1963, when John F. Kennedy was invited to Dallas, he at first was invited to receive a degree from Texas Christian University. But at the last minute, the trustees of this university decided they didn't want to give Kennedy the degree, so they had to come up with another place and excuse for him to be there. So they had him give a speech before the Civic Association, which was honoring the Advanced Research Center. And if you read John F. Kennedy's undelivered speech that he was supposed to give a half hour after he was murdered, in the very first paragraph he mentions this research center that Art Collins was the director of in Dallas at the time. Well, in 1979, the LBJ Library released an edited version of the Air Force One radio tapes on a cassette, 3 cassettes. And I obtained the copy of this, and I was dissatisfied with the original transcript that they accompanied the tapes. Not only was it inaccurate when you listen to it, but they misidentified a lot of the places mentioned on the tapes. For instance, when they mentioned the Liberty Station, according to the official transcript, it was the White House. And I knew that it was the Cedar Rapids relay station. So took me many months, but I developed my own transcript of the edited tape that they released from the LBJ Library. And I posted it on the internet when the internet came along. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, General Clifton, his estate, decided to sell his personal effects. And among his effects was a reel-to-reel White House Communication Agency tape of the Air Force One radio communications. And they actually had 2 exact copies of the same tape. And they donated one to the National Archives, and they sold the other one for $500,000 was the asking price. I don't know what happened to it. But the copy that they gave to the archives, I got a copy of, and I made a transcript of that and compared it to the tape that they released from the LBJ Library and discovered that it was a half hour longer. But it kicks in, the Clifton tape kicks in about 10 minutes into the LBJ Library tape, so they both contain unique information. So also the Clifton tape has a half a dozen what they call patches that aren't on the LBJ tape, that were edited out of the LBJ Library tape. So we have an indication of what they edited out. So I made a transcript of the Clifton tape, and I combined the 2. I put them in a chronological order and combined them. And one day I listened to the National Public Radio do a story on the Trevor Martin murder case in Florida, and they interviewed a forensic acoustical specialist, Ed Premiu, who testified at that trial about the cell phone conversations. So I called Premiu, and I asked him if he was interested in the White House, in the Air Force One radio tapes. And he said he was, and I told him of the problem of having the 2 tapes, and he said he would try to combine them, which he spent the entire summer after that, 3 or 4 months working on these tapes, and he effectively combined them using my transcript as a guide. So we now have a one seamless copy of the Air Force One tape. And one of his employees took the tape that he combined and added my transcript to it, so you can hear it and read my transcript as you're listening to it. And last October at the WEC conference, I presented that tape and we released it to the public, and we put it online. And since then, I worked with Ed and a guy named Jeff Carter, and we tried to cut down the 2.5-hour tape to less than 2 hours. We took the dead air out and we took some of the noise out, and we made a very high quality audio only version of the tape that's less than 2 hours, and we broke that into 8 15-minute sections that we're going to release hopefully as a radio program. And I'm going to introduce each of the 8 sections with a description of what you're hearing and who's on them, and ordinary people that can understand what's going on. And because the tape's so long, I can't play the whole tape today, but I have a 10-minute summary of what's on the tape, and it gives you a sample of what is on it and what it sounds like. And I'll play that, and then I'll open it up to questions if you have any.
I'm Bill Kelly. I'm a JFK assassination researcher. I run the blog called JFK Counter-Coup. The Air Force One radio tapes are the black box of the assassination accident, and they tell us a lot. What's not on the tapes is even maybe more important, what the military excised from the tapes. The Warren Commission did not have access to the Air Force One radio tapes, and nor did they ask for them. The first hint of them came out in William Manchester's book when he went to the White House and LBJ allowed him to read the transcript of the unedited tapes that he quotes from. The LBJ Library released their copy of the tape in the late 70s, and that was a cassette tape. It was about an hour and a half long. Now, the Clifton tapes were found among the effects of Air Force aide to the President, General Chester Clifton. And this tape is about a half hour longer than the old LBJ Library tape that we had for years, but both tapes contain unique information.
Andrew signed the interview, sir.
Colonel Norman, General LeMay's aide.
Right.
General LeMay is in a C-140. Last 3 numbers are 497. Sam, C-140.
497, last 3 numbers.
Right. He's inbound. His code name is Grandson, and I want to talk to him.
Grandson. Okay, sir, we'll see what we can do. We're real busy with Air Force One right now.
Okay, you don't have a capability to work more than one, huh?
Well, we're running Air Force One on 2 different frequencies. We're giving them 2 different patches at one time right now, and that's all we can do.
The Clifton tape is a reel-to-reel tape, so it's an older generation tape, a better quality tape. It's labeled White House Communication Agency, and we think that from the information on this tape, we might be able to track down where the other tapes are. We know a lot of what's not on the tapes because 3 reporters, William Manchester, T.H. White, and Pierre Salinger, were given access to a transcript of the unedited tapes. So we know the unedited tapes existed at one time. These 3 reporters quoted items off the tapes that aren't on there today. They edited out a lot of the military references.
I have a Liberty on the line with priority 1 patch. Roger. You want a patch, sir? Stand by when I Liberty give you a call. Okay, sir.
One of the unique aspects of my research is the identity of the Liberty station, Collins Radio. They were the Liberty station. When you listen to the tapes, you hear them talk Liberty, Liberty, give me this frequency, set me with this relay. They asked Liberty Station 100 times on the tapes to do something, and the Liberty Station is the Collins Radio headquarters in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where they had the contract for the radio relays of all the communications aboard Air Force One and the cabin of planes and the Strategic Air Command, General LeMay's bomber fleet. I was already familiar with Collins Radio because on November 1st, 1963, the New York Times reported that the CIA raider ship that had dropped off commandos in Cuba was leased to the Collins Radio Company of Richardson, Texas, which is affiliated with the one in Cedar Rapids. So Collins was serving as a cover for the CIA raider ship on November 1st, 1963, and they had worked with the CIA and other military operations before. In fact, Art Collins, the founder of the company, was a personal friend of Air Force General Curtis LeMay, who was a ham radio buff. LeMay gave all the Strategic Air Command contracts to Collins, and they also received the contracts to handle the Air Force One radio communications. If you read a book called coup d'etat practical handbook, it tells you how to conduct a coup. And if the assassination was in fact a real coup d'etat, the coup members would have to control the communications. That's part of the key elements of a coup. We look at the communications links here in Collins Radio and what's going on, and we see that those people that were in charge and had control over the communications network hated Kennedy. LeMay and these people despised Kennedy and were glad he was killed. They were his enemies. At the time of the assassination, Air Force One pilot James Swindell was listening to the Secret Service transmissions from the Dallas motorcade on Charlie Channel, which, if the Charlie Channel was recorded, it will contain the sounds of the final two shots. President Kennedy had ordered the Air Force One radio transmissions recorded only when the plane is in the air. So when LBJ got back to Air Force One, he made a few phone calls that were not recorded, or they said they weren't recorded. Those conversations are suspicious. LBJ called a lawyer named Goldberg from the Air Force One, and he also talked to another lawyer named J. Whitey Bullion. Bullion was a tax attorney. LBJ said, "I'll have to sell my Halliburton stock now." And of course, Halliburton was the Texas company that was one of the big defense contractors that got a lot of business when LBJ became president. The other call was to a lawyer named Goldberg, and he told LBJ to be sworn in right away and to have Sarah Hughes do it. There's no mention of Goldberg in any of the mainstream books or the official record. We only learned about it from Goldberg's obituary when he died. When the plane took off, the White House Communication Agency apparently began to tape record all of the conversations. And there were 3 radios on board that were being used at the time. And all 3 were busy the whole time the plane was in the air, 2 hours and 17 minutes. So we estimate there was 3 radios going for over 2 hours. There should be at least 6 hours of taped conversation, but in fact we only have 2 hours. That was the pinnacle of our government there, all in one plane. Trying to figure out what happened in those 2 hours and 17 minutes will tell us a lot about what happened in the assassination. The cabinet plane with the cabinet members on it were over the Pacific Ocean at the time of the assassination, and their response to the assassination is really important. Pierre Salinger was on that flight, and he contacted the White House Situation Room and attempted to get all the information he could on what was happening in Dallas.
Situation room, this is Wayside. You read me over? This is the Situation Room. I read you. Give me all available information on President, over. All available information on President follows. Colonel Donald E. and Governor Connolly have been hit in the car in which they were riding. We do not know no information. Mr. Bromley Smith is back here in the Situation Room now. We are getting our information over the tickers. Over. That is affirmative. Please keep us advised on here. This plane, on which Secretary of State, other cabinet ministers headed for Japan, turning around, returning to Honolulu, will arrive there approximately 2 hours. Over. We'll need all information to decide whether some party should go directly to Dallas. Over. Roger. You wish information as to whether some members of that party should go to Dallas. Affirmative. Do you have anything else, Wayside? No, any other information get a hold of us as rapidly as possible. All right. The Associated Press is coming out now with a bulletin to the effect that they believe the president was hit in the head. That just came in. Over.
The question of how the Air Force One received the information about Oswald being the assassin reportedly came from the White House Situation Room, where the Navy aide Oliver Hallett was telling Air Force One Oswald was the assassin and there was no conspiracy. This has also been attributed to McGeorge Bundy. None of this is on the tape that we have, but we do know that Oliver Hallett, the guy who was heard on the tapes talking to Air Force One, knew Oswald. His previous assignment was the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, where he was a Navy attaché, and his wife was Snyder's secretary. So when Oswald defected 3 years earlier, he handed his passport to Snyder. Hallett's wife was right there and later testified about Oswald's behavior. And so when Oliver Hallett in the Situation Room was telling the Air Force One that Oswald was the assassin, he knew Oswald, which I find astounding coincidence. I think there's other tapes out there that we can look for and maybe locate, and someday in the future we can have a complete picture of what happened on that return flight on November 22nd, 1963.
When I first received the second Cliff Carter tape, I was transcribing it, and I noticed the differences between the two, and I isolated the aspects that were edited out of the LBJ tape. And one of them was the reference to Colonel Dorman was trying to get in touch with LeMay, and I looked up him in the phone book or on the internet and found right away that he had been killed in Vietnam 3 years later. He was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, and he died there. But his wife lived in Princeton, not far from where I lived, his widow. And I got her on the phone, and I said, "Is this Mrs. Dorman, the widow of Colonel Dorman, LeMay's aide?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I'm transcribing the transcript of the Air Force One radio communications, and your husband is on the tape." And she says, "Well, I asked her about that day, and she says, well, I was working in the White House that day. She was working with the a gentleman named Castro, who was responsible for the remodeling of the White House in line with Jackie Kennedy's wishes. And she said she received a phone call from her husband who said that the Kennedy had been killed, and that she was supposed to leave the White House immediately and go home and stay home. And she gave me the name of her son and phone number, and I talked to her son. And her son was only a teenager at the time, but he witnessed the funeral in his backyard. They lived right off of the Arlington Cemetery. And he said that his father took him to General LeMay's plane, which was called Speckled Trout. It was an elite communications plane that was in a time of an emergency. It would go in the air and communicate to nuclear strikes. And he described what that plane was like, and I learned more about that. And also on the tape, there's a references to a stranger. Pierre Salinger relates the story of how he received orders from the Situation Room from a man codenamed Stranger, who told them to turn the plane around and come back to Washington and don't go to Dallas. And the Secretary of State Rusk on the plane says, well, we can't take orders from a guy named Stranger. Who is this person that's telling us to come back? So they called back to the Situation Room and said, who is Stranger? And the Stranger says, well, there's a code book on board in the safe of the pilot's safe. So they went to the safe, the pilot's safe, and the code book was missing. So they come back, and this is all on the tape. They says, we need the identity of Stranger. The code book is missing. And a few minutes later, the word comes back that the answer to your question is Major Harold Patterson. Major Harold Patterson is Stranger. And Pierre Salinger says, well, I know this guy, Patterson. He's a very reliable military officer, and he wouldn't give us the wrong information. And he tells that to Rusk. And so they turn the plane around and begin to flight back to Honolulu and Washington. So I looked up Patterson's name in Google, and I found him in Virginia and got him on the phone right away. And he said, yes, I was in charge of the White House Situation Room, and yes, the code book was missing, and I did have to reveal my identity over the open air thing. And he also confirmed that Oliver Howlett was there and that they communicated frequently with Air Force One in the military, and he gave me a lot of interesting information. And then a couple weeks later, Jefferson Morley called Patterson, and Patterson clammed up and refused to talk to him. But he did talk to me for about a half hour and confirmed everything that was on the tape. But we're trying to get Patterson to loosen up and tell us more about what was happening in there. And I asked Patterson, I said, there's a book on the history of the Situation Room, and were you interviewed for that? And he said, no, you're the first reporter to contact me about this information, about what happened that day in that room. And the effort so far, I have an appeal into the Air Force, to the Secretary of the Air Force. I have appealed the negative response to my Freedom of Information Act request for Air Force records. And hopefully the Secretary of the Air Force, a woman, she will be more sympathetic to our requests and try to help us locate what we believe still exists, and that is the unedited version of the White House Communication Agency radio communications with Air Force One. And I believe this record exists today. I think if they destroyed it, there would have been a record of its destruction. And I think that anyone who is ordered to destroy this tape would refuse to do so. And I think that the discovery of the Clifton tape is an example of how we can still locate records today that are out there that we haven't discovered yet. And I think the unedited Air Force One radio communication tape is one of those records that, that we can and should locate soon, and it would be a big piece of the puzzle of what happened that day. Thank you very much. Is there any questions?
Can you say something about the dialogue on the tape about finding LeMay?
Well, they request LeMay, and we discovered that LeMay was in northern Michigan at the time with his family, and he took a private plane from the cabin in Michigan where he was fishing and hunting to, he said he was going to go to Toronto where there's a base, but instead he went to a really small base nearby, and Andrews Air Force sent, the Andrews Air Force Base in Washington sent a small jet to pick him up, not his normal communication jet, the speckled trout. So LeMay returned to Andrews from Canada, and he apparently was taken by surprise by the assassination. He was unprepared for it. There is no mention on the tape of what the important message that Colonel Dorman had for LeMay. He said, "I have a very important message. He's going to arrive at Andrews in a half hour, and I have to get this message to him before he arrives." And so we never learned what that message was. At least we haven't learned so far. But LeMay did not take his regular plane back from Canada. He took another plane, and we never did discover what the important message was that Dorman was trying to get to him.
Yeah, Bill, is there any discussion on the about where the autopsy would be held?
Yes, there's a whole much dialogue on the tape about whether it should be at Walter Reed or Bethesda, and that's on the tape. And I'm going to put links to all these sites on my blog. If you want to go to my blog, JFK Countercoup, I'll have links soon to all the important sites where you can either listen to the tape and read the transcript, or listen to the high fidelity tape by itself, or read my transcript, combined transcript, and see for yourself what they discuss. Yeah.
That guy Carl Mathers that worked for Collins.
Yes.
Is there any? Is that just a coincidence? That,
I don't know. There's my file on Collins Radio is now expanded. There's a dozen connections to Collins Radio. For instance, Oswald's wife Marina married Porter, who was an employee of Collins Radio, and a Collins Radio executive from Cuba was murdered in Miami in 1965. So I have in 1993 at the CAPA convention in D.C., I did a report on the Collins Radio connections that since then I have added to, but I'll have a link up to my Collins Radio Connections article as well, which I've completely expanded on since my 93 presentation. I've added new things all the time as I learn them about the company. But yes, Carl Mather, I learned today that he was not only a friend of Tippit and came to his house to console the widow after the assassination, but Carl Mather was with Tippit earlier in the morning that day.
Well, what kind of documentation do you have of that? Of Mathers being with Tippit in the morning?
I just learned that myself from Bill Simpich yesterday. So,
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and Bill's a very good reporter, and I believe that he has good evidence of that. Yeah.
I should know this, forgive me, but where was McGeorge Bundy when he was in communication?
He was in the Situation Room
So he's in the same place as the other folks?
with Patterson and Howitt. They were in that room, and they were communicating with Air Force One through the Liberty Station.
So his dialogue is interspersed with this other dialogue?
Yes. And we know a lot of what's not on the tape today from the three reporters were given access at the White House. They were let to read and quote from a transcript of the unedited tape. And all three, William Manchester, T.H. White, and Pierre Salinger, quote sections of the transcript that aren't on the tape. So what they thought was important to quote in their books have been excised from the tape that we have today.
Well, Manchester's papers are available, I forget where, his draft and research for his own book, so I don't know if that's a place to follow.
Yeah, well, he's kept a lot of that from the review board, Manchester did. But he quotes General McGeorge Bundy telling Air Force One that the assassination was the result of a lone assassin and there was no conspiracy. And Max Holland wrote a book on all this called The Assassination Tapes, in which he quotes extensively from the Air Force One tapes, but he leaves out the whole Liberty Station and the significant connections. But he does reveal the fact that how it was in the Situation Room, and he was also in Moscow in the room when Oswald defected, which I think is pretty amazing coincidence.
Wasn't at the time, right around the assassination, for about an hour, all communications in the White House went out?
Yeah.
So how's the Situation Room able?
Well, the Situation Room was working on a radio. They weren't using a landline. They were, and the radio is a public airways. Anyone that has a shortwave radio that knew the frequencies they were using, they could listen in. And there was a group in Colorado of amateur ham radio buffs who routinely listened into Air Force One radio communications because they knew what the frequencies were that Collins did that. And I think one of these amateur guys could have taped it. You know, like there could be a tape out there from somebody that, and also Liddell, the University of Miami professor who wrote a book on the Cuban connections, he says that Castro himself told the radio listening posts in Lourdes, Cuba, to tune into Texas that day, because that's where Kennedy was going to be, and he wanted a copy of the Air Force One radio communication. So he ordered his people that listened into these things. So Cuba has a copy of the tape that our guys won't give us. You know, we might be able to get a copy of the tape from Castro, maybe. But I believe that we will one day have a copy of the unedited tapes, because there's so many possibilities of obtaining it. And I think it's going to answer a lot of our questions about what they decided about that they edited out and they thought should be secret, and they cut that out, especially about the autopsy, about the military response. Anyway, I think that one day we will have a more full picture of what we are now having. We are now missing pieces of this puzzle.
Who owns the one that they paid $500,000 for?
Yes, it was a company, RAAB is a auction house out of Philadelphia, and they specialize in antiquities and like historic signatures and photographs. And they had a market price of $500,000, and I tried to contact them to find out if they ever sold it, but they never responded back to me. But it's RAAB. It's a company in Philadelphia that has the Clifton tapes.
So they're just trying to sell them?
Yeah, they just want to market it. But they had two copies, so they gave one to the archives, and the archives posted it. You can listen. But the Clifton tape is not complete. And what we did was combine the two, and you can get the combination of the two from Ed Premier's site, Premier Forensic Acoustics. And I'll have the link to that on my blog up later today.
Do we have any sense of all the persons who are present in the Situation Room at that time?
No, but I think Patterson could tell us that, and that's why we have to get Mr. Patterson to talk. I have acquired a close personal association with a guy named Katz, and he was the Army person in charge of the continuity of government in the White House that day, and he said to me last week that he knew Patterson, and he wants me to give him the contact information, and he said that he will contact Patterson and tell him that we are legitimate researchers, and we're just looking for the truth and not trying to, we're not conspiracy theorists, but we're actually researchers trying to determine what actually happened that day. And hopefully he'll cooperate with us. Anything else? Well, thank you for coming, and I appreciate it.